Please welcome former Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, Ovide Mercredi, with his presentation, Taking Northern Development Back to Mutual Advantage. S'il vous plaît, veuillez accueillir l'ancien chef de l'Assemblée des Premières Nations, Ovide Mercredi, qui nous offre une présentation sur le thème de développement du Nord à l'avantage de tous.
Minugi Sigao. It's a beautiful day. I rushed to the airport yesterday because I like coming to Thunder Bay. And I had to sit there until 2 o'clock this morning because the plane from Edmonton was late. So I'm like Bob, I don't want to point fingers. But I'm glad I have a stubborn streak to me, and I stuck it out and caught that plane and checked in at 3:30. So this is also your lucky day because I'm too tired to talk long. Because if you think Bob can stand here and chat with you, I can do the same. Anyway, I want to recognize the chiefs who are here, all the elders, Mayor Bolio and the councillors from Greenstone, and all of you who came here to be part of this discussion about the development of the North. My talk is about getting back to what is basic. And we don't have too far to look to learn what is basic in relationships. We just have to go back to the early history of this country and learn from that. So prior to any contact with white people or any kind of people in this world, this country was owned, occupied, and controlled completely by the indigenous people. This was their territory. This is their homeland. And they lived here for centuries, thousands and thousands of years. And they created a culture, a way of life that was compatible with their environments. They didn't create skyscrapers. They didn't have to. They didn't build airports. They didn't have to, because their way of life sustained their culture. And what was that culture? Well, most people think it's all about hunting, fishing, trapping, but it was more than that. Because as you know, in your own culture, it's also a part about how you worship and what you believe in, how you worship God, what your belief system is. The First Nations people had their own spirituality, and it worked for them. But also, they had a way of dealing with children, a way of raising family. They had what they called the extended family, which is also shared by many cultures, including Canadians. But the extended family that sustained them for many years was put in jeopardy by the residential school system. And it has created in modern time for Indigenous people a lot of grievances, a lot of trauma, and a hell of a lot of pain. And some might say at great cost to the country in terms of supporting the support that is needed for looking after children. Now the culture, what is culture it's also language. Tapskud sumarait yan inaw yan, kiapit ngat stan yapat stan, kagis no magawian, mego sinapes yan. We have a language, and we value our language in the same way that you value your language, whether it's French or English. We take pride in it. And it's not inferior to any other language. Now, it may be that we didn't have words like cede, release, and surrender, which are words in the treaty. But the fact is, these are new ideas that were introduced by the settlers who came here, who wanted our property, our lands. So they came with their culture, with their understanding of the world. So culture is about a way of life, as I said, but it's also about how people make a livelihood. That's part of culture. And I'm a student of history, and I study a lot about Western civilization, what we call civilization, and all the transformations that Western society has undertaken over the years. And I still see that the battles that they had in the Middle Ages are playing out today, even in the Ukraine. So this whole idea of territory is very much a big part of Western civilization. Just as it's a big part for us too. The idea of territory is big for us. Except we don't have the machinery, the weaponry to defend our land in a way we see across the country, across the world. But the idea of territory is also part of culture. This is something that is also very, very current in Canada. We have an election coming up in Quebec, for example, and the issue of Quebec sovereignty is one of the issues being discussed. Because the idea of territory for the French settlers has never left that land. That idea is still there. And it comes out every now and then in the form of Quebec sovereignty. So don't be surprised. The point I'm making is, don't be surprised or offended when First Nations people say, this is my territory, this is our territory. Because it comes from our own understanding about our worldview, about our way of life, and who we are as a people. And it's really similar to the views other people have about themselves. Like when people say to me, we're all Canadians, meaning give up your rights and just be an ordinary citizen, which is hard for me to do, given the fact that I was raised to believe that Itaski that this is our land, that this is still our land. Right? And if you grow up with that kind of understanding in your family, you're not going to surrender that belief very quickly to anybody that tells you be a Canadian. Right? Now, when I talk about this idea of returning to basics in relationships, I'm referring to the time of the early settlement of this country, before treaty. Because when you examine our history, you'll see that it was a relationship based on mutual gain, mutual benefit. It was about trade. It was primarily about the fur trade, but it was more than that because our people also shared their knowledge about the territory, hunting, fishing, and they shared these resources with the settlers. And the Hudson Bay Company and the Northwest Company, they didn't claim territory, they came to trade. And they didn't say that they owned the animals, because in our system, in our belief system as a people, no one owns the animals, and that it would be foolish to try to say you own them. But they are part of the land, and we harvested them, and it just so happened that the early settlers needed that for their own purposes, for part of their own economic gain. But it was a mutual relationship of benefit. And it was also based on friendship, something that seems to have been forgotten, that the early relationships were about trade and friendship. And the early treaties that were made in this country with indigenous people were about trade and friendship. And then after a while, when the Europeans became numerous in North America, and the Americans were doing their own little trip down south, and the French were over here in the east doing their own little trip as well, and then the English doing their own trip on our territories, right? And then because they never got along in Europe, what would they expect them to get along here in the new soil, and they never got along here. So they started fighting. And that's where the military alliances, so we have treaties for military alliances. That's why the Mohawks were with the English, the Hurons were the French, and so on. So this is all part of our history. And it's about friendship, establishing friendships. And somehow we have forgotten that. And I think it's time for us to remind ourselves that, as the Supreme Court of Canada said, we're all here to stay. And we better learn to get along. And that's not going to be easy, because the First Nations people, because of their oppression over the centuries, are not very trusting right now. And you can't really blame our people from lacking trust because of the way in which we have been impacted by Canada as a country. This summer I'm going to Charlottetown to speak to some young people about Confederation. And the question I'm going to ask them is, what right did 36 people have to form a country on lands that did not belong to them? Because that's essentially what happened a couple of years before 1867 in Charlottetown. And I'll see where that discussion goes, because that's what you're facing now in terms of northern development, is that question, what right do you have to come to our territory and develop our lands without our consent? It's the same idea, that people need to be involved, they need to be consulted, they need to be part of the plan. And we are not part of the plan yet. Not yet. So after the Canada became a nation state in 1867, that's when this idea of nation building became the agenda for MacDonald and his cabinet. So they had to make treaties with people. They had to make treaties in order to make room for themselves to expand the boundaries of Lower and Upper Canada westward. Treaty 9 that we have here is an example of a very late treaty that was made in the 1920s, I think 1925 or 1926. But these treaties were also based on this idea that the First Nations people could keep their culture, that they could keep their way of life. Now, what does that mean in contemporary time? Well, it should mean that they should be able to drink the water from the lake and the rivers without having to boil it, because that was what they had before the treaty was made. And it should mean that they should be able to carry on with their hunting, fishing, and gathering lifestyle on their natural territories without having their habitat destroyed by development. In other words, the treaties also are about protecting the land and the living things on top of it, like the moose, for example. Because if development is done without any concern about the environment, the treaty right to hunt becomes meaningless. If there are no animals, there is no treaty right to hunt. These are some basic ideas I'm sharing with you. And I'm doing this because I want you to understand us. Because if you understand us, then we can begin a dialogue, right? And part of the understanding that you'll see is that we're very much interested in mutual gain. Now, in my community of Grand Rapids, I was just a very young man when strangers showed up and took over control of everything that used to be ours. Those strangers are called the province of Manitoba and Manitoba Hydro. These are corporate entities. And they showed up with the idea of creating hydroelectrical power on our traditional lands. And they wanted to take the power of the Grand Rapids, Misipawistik, and convert it to electricity. And they had a master plan that was prepared for them by engineers. And they decided they would dam the Grand Rapids. But they never talked to us about it. Maybe there would have been other ways of doing it without completely silencing the rapids and destroying the rapids altogether, completely blocking it, and creating a forebay that flooded our neighboring community called Chimahoin at the time, but now called Easterville. Cree people, my cousins, whose reserve is underwater, whose grave sites are underwater. So this is the kind of development that we don't want. And to paraphrase the language of one of the elders from Cross Lake, which is another northern reserve that was impacted by subsequent hydro dams in northern Manitoba, the elder said, Stanley Beardy, he's now deceased, he said it would be like someone coming to our territory, taking our slaw pail and throwing it in our traditional lands. That's what Manitoba Hydro did to us. Right? That is why there's so little trust, because of what past development has done. And the First Nations people are not isolated from each other. They are very connected to each other. They are aware of what is happening in different parts of this province, or even different other provinces, different parts of the country, what's happening to other Indigenous people. So we are informed. We are aware of what we want, and we are very much interested in the dialogue that has been missing. Now, the treaties also, as you heard Bob say, that the federal position, that the government's position is that they extinguished Aboriginal title, and that the intention of the Crown was to come and take our land and leave us with only reserves and $5 a year. I mean, where in the world can you buy that much land for $5 a year? Where can you do that? And if you look at treaty negotiations right now where there's been unceded territory like British Columbia, those negotiations have been taking place for 20 years with no conclusion. No one is going to say to me that in my community, my people surrendered their territory in one day. I refuse to believe that. I'd rather believe what my people tell me, that we agreed to share the land, but we did not give up everything. And that when I was growing up in my community, one of the elders said to me one time, as far as your eye can see, all the land you see is ours, and all the waters you see still all belongs to us. Right? Now, my reserve is only about 2 miles by about 5 miles. That's my reserve, right? Our territory is bigger than that by probably 1,000 times. And I know my history, just as the Treaty 9 chiefs know their history. And we know that from recorded records of what happened during treaty, even by non-Aboriginal people, places doubt, not just in our minds, but anybody that wants to have an open mind, that there was any real surrender of Aboriginal title. In my community, when the treaty surveyor came, 2 years after the treaty, and our treaty was made in 1875, 2 years after the treaty, the surveyor showed up, and the chief said, "What are you doing here?" This is recorded by the surveyor for the Dominion Government of Canada. And the surveyor said, "Well, we came here to give you the reserve under the treaty." And the guy said, and the chief said, "We never agreed to a treaty." And if you look at the records of non-Aboriginal people for Treaty 9, you'll see that there's no meeting of the minds. Now, the Crown might take a position that they extinguished our title. We'll take the position that we never did. Now, Bob talked about this idea of uncertainty. That's where the uncertainty comes from. That's why it's very important for the Government of Canada to eventually deal with treaty implementation. Because those treaties have to be interpreted, not just in favor of Canada, but for mutual benefit. They have to be interpreted in favor of the Aboriginal people too. It cannot be one-sided. Now, what about the future? Like, where do we go with this breakdown in our relationship? I mean, how do we cope with the poverty that's in our communities? How can Thunder Bay or Greenstone help First Nations people liberate themselves from poverty? And think about this in terms of the prejudice and racism that we deal with as Aboriginal people. It's our responsibility, every one of us, to challenge those attitudes. Because those feelings, those negative feelings, prevent us from creating a good relationship. I'm not asking you to marry me or to love me or even to kiss me, right? I'm saying just simply that if we have a common vision about development in the North, it should be based on the historical relationship, which was mutual gain and friendship. Mutual gain and friendship. That's why I'm very glad that I'm working with Greenstone, because they support the First Nations people on environmental protection, and they support the First Nations on their stand on the environment. But they also want development, but they want to do it in partnership with the First Nations. Greenstone wants to develop just as Thunder Bay has. And why should all the resources in the North always go to Thunder Bay or Sudbury? What about sharing? How about sharing some of that wealth, some of that development with these other communities? I mean, that's a dialogue that needs to happen too. How we share the benefits of the growth that's going to come in Northern Ontario. But that growth, as Bob said earlier, needs to be done with the consent of the First Nations people, with their full participation. And development should never happen in the way it happened in my community. And I'll give you another example. When Hydro came there, they built a town site for their workers, completely segregated from my community. They built, in a sense, a suburb of Winnipeg. Pavement, electricity, running water. Hydro has been in Grand Rapids for almost 45 years now. And 2 years ago, they finally extended water and sewer to the village. Imagine that. Like, it would take that long before they would share that quality of life with the Métis community. They never shared that quality with the Reserve because the Reserve got the money from Union Affairs to have water and sewer 10 years ago. It wasn't Hydro that did that. So we're suing, of course we're suing the federal government for breach of fiduciary responsibility. And we'll see where that goes, because they don't want to come to the table and negotiate with us because they believe they did nothing wrong, and yet they're the ones who were dealing with the Crown in right of the province, and they were representing the interests of the First Nations people. And at that time, our relationship with the Crown was that of a ward of the state. So they had a fiduciary responsibility to do the right thing for us, and they didn't do that. Right? Now, I wanted to share that with you because I want to be honest about this issue about relationships. There's no sense beating around the bush about it. We're not getting along right now. But we better learn to get along. Right? The First Nations are my people. They have to begin to trust. And part of that trust will come about as they begin to feel more comfortable that the governments are listening to them. So part of our responsibility then, I think, is to convince the governments to listen. To listen. We're not saying capitulate. We're not saying surrender. We're saying listen. Begin to talk and see where it leads. One of my retrospective views of my community is that if they had come to my community when I was chief, they would still have had a hydro project, but not what they have, not what they left behind. They could have still harnessed the rapids in a totally different way that would allow our people to still hear the rapids and still know that the fish can go up the rapids to Cedar Lake, from Lake Winnipeg to Cedar Lake. Things could have been done differently, is the point I'm making. And development in the past, in terms of mining, has been done with the idea that the miners just need to go to the province for consent. But since 1982, and I've been involved in this constitutional discussion about this country for many years. I knew Bob when he was a young man, right? He just gave you his age today. I'm 3 years more wiser than he is. And so we dealt with constitutional reform together during the Charlottetown Accord. But the reason why we tried to transform the country using the Constitution was because that would have been one way of recognizing Aboriginal sovereignty, Aboriginal territory. And it would also a way in which we would have shared the wealth of the country by transfer payments, not contribution agreements, but transfer payments from the federal government and the provinces to the First Nations so they can meet the housing crisis in their communities and so on. It was all part of Charlottetown. And Charlottetown also said to the government, we have a constitutional mandate to honor and to respect the treaties and to implement the treaties in a manner these treaties are understood by the Indian people. Charlottetown recognized the inherent right of Aboriginal people to their own forms of government. And the language was that the Aboriginal people would have one of the three orders of government in Canada. one of the three, not the third order, 1, 2, 3, but one of the three, 1, 2, 3, like this. Not like that. It was a masterful compromise, and had it been adopted in a referendum, our discussion here would be somewhat different today. It would be dramatically different. I don't think we would have, we'd be talking so much in terms of the negative past, but we'd be talking more about, in a positive way, what we have built together and what much more we have to do. Now, in terms of the future, like Greenstone has made an overtures to First Nations people to say, let's work together. Well, they have to come forward and say, let's work together. Right? They have to take a leap of faith too. It's not one direction here. It's about mutual friendship. It's the idea that as First Nations people, we are strong enough now to negotiate for ourselves. And if we need help every now and then, we'll get people like the former Premier of Ontario to help us. But the reality is that the political sands have shifted in this country because of the patriation of the Constitution. See, Trudeau himself did not believe in Aboriginal rights at the very beginning. But it was under his leadership that we have now in this country a provision in our Constitution of this country that says the treaty and Aboriginal rights of the Aboriginal people are hereby recognized and affirmed. And there was a provision with respect to treaties on Aboriginal rights for the Prime Minister to convene constitutional conferences with the leaders of the Aboriginal people. And Trudeau chaired those meetings. And when he decided to go for a walk in the snow, then Brian Mulroney chaired those meetings. Right? And the initial ones failed, but the second one, after we defeated Meech Lake in Manitoba, but the second one succeeded in producing the Charlottetown Accord. So it is possible. The political will can be achieved here to transform this country. And it is possible to do it not only at the national level, but at the level where we're at right here. At the community level, from the municipal governments to the First Nations governments, at that level. Because the way Canada is structured is that the foundation of democracy is not what happens in Parliament. The foundation of democracy is what happens in the municipal government. And for us as First Nations people, our foundation for democracy is not what happens in Parliament, it's what happens in our communities, in our own governments. So we come together with the same sovereignty, the same idea, the same capacity for improving the lives of our people. And now we have to sort of think about it in terms of how do we come to mutually improving the lives of all our people, not just us. Right? Ninan Pogo. Ninan Pogo. We can't go there. Ninan Pogo. Ninan Pogo is Cree for just us. Because if we approach northern development on that basis, say Thunder Bay says Ninan Pogo, Greenstone says Ninan Pogo, Webequay says Ninan Pogo, so on. If that's the approach we take, we have no future here. We will go down the road of a lot of controversy and a hell of a lot of bad feelings, and we'll be condemning our children, our grandchildren, to a life where they are fighting for their basic human rights, where there will be no trust between people. I'll stop there, and I want to thank all of you for taking the time to listen to what Bob had to say, because Bob laid out what needs to be done. And my role here was just simply try to educate more of you more about ourselves as First Nations, and that we're not here to hurt you. And one of the obligations we have under treaty is to maintain a peaceful coexistence with the settlers and not to engage in any kind of violent act against you. That's a treaty right that you have. So thank you all.
It's always a pleasure to have Ovide with us, and am I ever glad he was tired? No. I think from the day we started working with Ovide, it sure has made a lot of changes for our community. I feel proud, though, that Ovide is speaking in this way and explaining the process. And I want to say this because Ovide touched on it. We want to work together. We want to build together, and that's the synopsis of what this great country of ours is. We want to share. I have to say that the municipality of Greenstone in the Long Lac Ward back in the 80s, we did a project such as what Ovide pointed out. We did share, for example, with great effort, negotiations with the federal government, water and sewer services in that community, which were very far apart. And that, to me, and we talked about that, Ovide, and I think it's an example of, you know, I guess having the forefront in our community of working with our First Nations because we're so close. And I think it's, the message is clear. There's definitely a new trend out there, and we have to, especially as Northerners, to work together, and if we want to see development, and I feel very proud, and I feel that it will happen, and it's all about patience, but it will happen, and things will happen. Sonny, you had a question?
Oh. I need to know the name of your treaty negotiator, because to get $5, because we only get $4.
What is it?
I need to know the name of your treaty because he only gets $4 and you're getting $5.
He was a relative of mine. His name was Atkinson. Call on me to negotiate for you. It runs in the family.
Well, again, with that being said, Ovide, I have something here to present to you, and it's, I think it represents what we've been talking about in the last 2 days. It's something that was made for Greenstone. It's a logo, and it's the Dreamcatcher by Loy Kakavetam, and it's strengthening our roots, and it's building trust, awareness, and I think that's what you've been talking about. So thank you very much, Ovide,
Okay, thank
for
you.
the presentation. Oh.